What does it take for a man, born into poverty, hunted by the Nazis, forced into exile, to later kneel down in front of the victims of those same Nazis, without saying a single word, yet speaking louder than any speech could? This is the story of Willy Brandt. A refugee, a mayor under siege, a chancellor who redefined Germany's place in the world, and a man whose simple gesture of humility became one of the most powerful symbols of reconciliation in modern history. Willy Brandt was not born into privilege. He entered the world in 1913 in Lübeck, Germany, the illegitimate child of a working-class mother. His birth name was Herbert Fromm. In a deeply conservative society, growing up as an illegitimate child was no small stigma. But rather than breaking him, it forged in him a sense of independence, of being an outsider, and perhaps a quiet empathy for those left on the margins. As a teenager, he joined socialist youth groups and soon became a fiery critic of the rising tide of fascism. By the time Hitler seized power in 1933, young Herbert Fromm had already chosen a new name: Willy Brandt. It was more than a pseudonym, it was a shield, a new identity to protect himself as he went underground working against the Nazi regime. But Germany was no longer safe. Brandt fled into exile, first to Norway, then to Sweden. Imagine the loneliness of a young man, barely in his 20s, stripped of home and country, surviving as a journalist in foreign lands while the world he knew collapsed into dictatorship and war. Yet exile was not silence for Brandt. From Scandinavia, he used his pen and his voice to campaign against Hitler, to remind the world that another Germany still existed, one that resisted. When the war ended, Brandt returned to a Germany in ruins. Berlin, once the proud capital, was a city divided and broken. Here, in the ruins, he found his stage. Rising through the ranks of the Social Democratic Party, he became mayor of West Berlin in 1957. And then, in 1961, the unthinkable happened. The Berlin Wall went up overnight. Imagine standing as the leader of a city, knowing that barbed wire and concrete had just split families, friends, and entire communities. Brandt could not tear it down, but he became the voice of West Berliners, embodying their defiance and their hope. When John F. Kennedy visited in 1963 and declared, "Ich bin ein Berliner," Willy Brandt stood beside him, symbolizing that Berlin's struggle was not forgotten. But Brandt was not only a local leader, his vision was larger. He believed Germany had to come to terms with its past and find a way to coexist with the East, not through weapons, but through dialogue. In 1969, he became Chancellor of West Germany, and this vision took center stage. His policy became known as Eastern policy. At a time when the Cold War was defined by walls, iron curtains, and nuclear threats, Brandt dared to suggest something different: change through rapprochement. Rather than pretending the East didn't exist, he reached out. He signed treaties with Poland and the Soviet Union, recognizing borders, acknowledging past wrongs, and lowering the temperature of the Cold War. And then, on December 7, 1970, came the moment that defined him forever. Brandt traveled to Warsaw, Poland. He visited the memorial commemorating the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, where Jewish resistance fighters had faced annihilation during World War II. As cameras rolled and the world watched, Brandt approached the memorial. He stood silently, and then, without warning, he fell to his knees. There were no words, just silence. It was the silence of a German chancellor acknowledging crimes committed by his nation. A silence that carried the weight of millions of murdered lives. A silence that crossed borders and generations. Many Germans were stunned. Some criticized him, calling it unnecessary. But across the world, the image of Willy Brandt kneeling in Warsaw became a defining gesture of humility, reconciliation, and moral courage. That moment helped secure his place in history, and in 1971, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to bring East and West closer together. But Brandt's story was not without pain and betrayal. In 1974, a scandal erupted. One of his closest aides was exposed as a spy for East Germany. The shock was devastating. Although Brandt himself was not implicated, the scandal shook his government and his party's confidence. He resigned as chancellor, a decision that left many wondering what more he could have achieved had he stayed in power longer. Yet even after his resignation, he remained a global voice for peace and justice. He chaired international commissions, spoke out against nuclear weapons, and advocated for the global South, calling attention to poverty and inequality worldwide. His career was proof that leadership did not end with office. When Willy Brandt died in 1992, Germany was once again at a crossroads. The Berlin Wall had just fallen 3 years earlier, and the country he had once fought to unify was finally whole again. His funeral drew leaders from around the world. It was not just a farewell to a politician, but to a man who had lived through exile, dictatorship, division, and reconciliation, and who had never stopped believing in a better Germany. So, what does it take for a man to kneel? It takes the courage to admit a nation's guilt, the humility to bow before victims, and the vision to understand that reconciliation is stronger than pride. Willy Brandt showed the world that true leadership is not measured in military might or fiery speeches, but sometimes in silence, in gestures, in the humanity we dare to show. His life remains a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who choose bridges over walls, dialogue over silence, and humility over arrogance, and that sometimes the quietest moments echo the loudest across history.